Happy noon, Algeta. Nembala mi, Waneen Polly. Mi hammas through long kam sindam wantam yupla. Well, that was from Papua New Guinea in Pidgin, kind of a Pidgin English, saying, "Hi, my name's Waneen Polly, and I'm really glad to be with you today." Greetings are something that we get accustomed to in wherever we go. I was just talking to Mr. Hay in the row there, and I was saying when I was in Finland in the 1970s, hello was hey, hey. He would have great fun there with his name. When I was first a Peace Corps volunteer in Sierra Leone in the 1970s, I was trying to quietly walk across town getting ready for school. And the way I get ready for things is that I think about them all the time as I'm going, like I was when I was on my way in the car down here thinking about exactly what I was going to say today. And it wasn't possible to be just quiet and think, because as I walked along, people who would be sitting on their verandas having breakfast or walking in the streets would say, "Padi kusheo, audi badi, audi man, audi pikanini, audi wife. Hi, how are you? How's your husband? How's your wife? How are your children?" And because I was apparently, it was hard for people to distinguish what I was because I was different in Sierra Leone, which is right here in West Africa, if your geography is not your best suit. But it was very gregarious and outgoing. My first consultancy, or one of my first consultancies, when I was a consultant on and off for 23 years as I lived internationally, was on the island of Yap. And Yap is out here in the Pacific, and it's so small. It's north of Guam and west of Truk. I don't think anyone here is old enough to remember the Trust Territories of the Pacific, and that's how you might remember those places. My mentor and colleague there was a guy named John Mutmag. And I said to John, "How do you greet people in Yap?" And he said, I said, "What?" I said, "You just raise your eyebrows?" That was also yes. And I said, "So where do I look? Do I look in your eyes?" "Oh, no. You just look generally at your face." Excuse me, I've lost my voice for a whole week, so let's see how this goes. John said, I said, "You just look generally at your face." "Okay." I said, "What if I want to say something? What do I say?" "Kafal." "What's kafal mean?" "Goodbye." "Why?" "Because we don't want to ever kind of assume we're invading into somebody else's space or spirit." Well, now on an island of 6,000 people, everybody knew everybody. And so you didn't need to say things. Excuse me, didn't need to say things because you were known by someone else. I'm going to need some water. I thought this was going to be okay, but... Well, in Sierra Leone, there were babies everywhere. And if you've been in Africa or seen pictures of Africa, there are always pictures of babies on women's backs. And so I said to John, "I see no babies here. Where are the babies?" And he said, "Well, they're everywhere." "Where?" "Well, they were in the basket." Once again, they were something that you were trying to save them from being interfered by the spirit, that someone might be able to take their spirit. And this was one of my first understandings of wherever you are in a culture, you learn cues. But that the cues in one culture only give you places to ask questions in another culture. And so in Yap, the answers to the questions were very different than the answers in Sierra Leone. I've been very privileged to work in over 30 countries, over 23 years. I started out as a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa, went on to be a consultant for Peace Corps, moved to Micronesia, which is where Yap is, here, the Federated States of Micronesia, Republic of Palau, Then went on to Papua New Guinea to be the country director of the Peace Corps program, and then spent another 12 years practicing as a consultant. My home base was on my sailboat, which still lives in the Barcelona harbor, and I went back and forth to the former Yugoslavia, to India, Pakistan, Nepal. I did some work in this part of the world, and also out of Geneva. Excuse me. And I'm thinking about lessons that I learned. One of the most important lessons I learned was in Papua New Guinea. I'd been living there several months. I had many friends, Papua New Guinean women friends. I'd been working in health and child spacing. And I was also, as a country director, working with groups that we placed volunteers in very unusual locations in the country. And this was a place on top of a mountain in Eastern Highlands Province. And I'd been dropped in by a helicopter on the top of one mountain. And during that day before, excuse me, I had walked down one mountain and had to be pulled up another mountain because it was much too steep. I had the lung capacity and the strength of somebody who lived in the flatlands on the coast. And while being pulled up the mountain again to meet with a women's group, a young woman had come by me, and she was barefoot. She had was carrying her baby in a billum like this on her head, and she had the baby in the billum, and she had another billum full of sticks and sweet potatoes in another billum. And she raced right by me as these men were pulling me up the mountain. And later that day, I was sitting with a group of women, and I was listening to them and asking them, what do you need here? What should the female Peace Corps volunteer who's coming to be with you, what should she do with you? And the women were, excuse me, giving me answers. And they said, in my head, I'm going, oh, that's not right. Well, that's not right. That can't be right. And I caught myself, and I thought, what am I doing? Do you have your head goes like that? You're talking to people, and they're saying something. You say, oh, that's not my experience. And I thought, what in the world do I know about being a woman in this village and what she needs? She is living without electricity. She's on the top of a mountain. She has to carry her babies and her food up and down this mountain. What's wrong? What's happening? And I thought, well, I thought that I knew something because I had all of these very good friends who were Papua New Guinean women who told me stories. And I did understand something, but I understood something very different from a different part of the country than these women lived in. The important lesson for me was, instead of letting that little voice go off in my head and cloud what I was hearing, instead I needed to always say, what don't I understand? That's your true experience. These were their true experiences. What don't I understand? Papua New Guinea was rich in many ways, as was the whole Pacific Island experience, where I lived for over 6 years and went back and forth for 13 years. Very humbling when you go back and look at a project you thought you were doing a great job on, and you now know a lot more and realize where you made mistakes. Pacific Islanders tell stories in a way that I think I'm doing with you today. They tell one story, and then they say, Ami osim display something. It's a lot like this. And then they tell another story, and they tell another story. And it's kind of a spiral in, but they never tell you the conclusion. You need to figure that out. You're honored by being able to figure that out. While I was in Sierra Leone, there were Muslim and Christians. And the Muslim women were my neighbors, and they looked just like African women that you can imagine with headdresses and boo-boos and carrying their babies on their backs. And they were my friends, and they took care of me. When I got sick, they brought me food. One of my neighbor's sons died, and I was observing, what do I do? I'd not been at a funeral in this place, and I thought, well, I just need to follow what it is that the other people are doing. So I watched for a while, and the men would come in, and they would go off to the side, and the women would come in, and as soon as they hit the front porch, they would fall down on their knees, and they would weep, and then they would be taken to meet the mother, and then they would go inside the house, and slowly women would go out the front, and you got closer and closer to the body, and you'd go out the back door. Well, I wasn't quite able to weep fully, but I followed the pattern and sat by the body and talked to the mother. And when I went in back of the house, I heard one of the women saying actually to the woman, the wife, or one of the two wives in the house, saying, "Who is that white woman?" And I was so touched when my neighbor said, I'm one black Mary. She's just another black woman. In that environment, when the boy was being buried, he was taken by the men, and they did a Muslim prayer over him. And the women pounded rice and blew it into the air as part of their animist faith about how you help the body and the soul to transcend into the next world. Other Muslim women I worked with included women in the former Yugoslavia. I was in the former Yugoslavia 3 times between the wars that had happened there after the first war and between the war with Serbia, and I was working with a USAID organization that was supporting non-nationalistic, democratically oriented advocacy women's groups. These groups, as you can believe, after they had a war, they were not easy to find, but they found amazing women who were doing things that were just so profound in wherever they were planted. The Muslim women in those communities looked like you and me. They would be dressed like us. They would have jobs in working with violence against women or being government officials. And the things that we think about what happened with religion in that community was so different than when we would think that that's something that the Muslims did or the Christians did or the Catholics did, because the reason for the conflicts there had sometimes to do with wars that happened 600 years ago and who had won and who had lost. I sat with women whose sons and husbands had been ripped out during the night by neighbors that they had been friends with. The neighbors were the powerful people or the more abundant people in that community. And they were pulled out, and they watched their sons and husbands be shot in front of them. And in that environment, I learned something that I knew before, but it just became so much more clear that if you're trying to understand from people how a project works, you really must listen to their story. There's not a way that people are going to trust you to tell you something unless you listen to their whole story. So we sat, and sometimes for a whole day, and ate food or listened to the women one by one tell their stories of loss before we ever got to the place of telling me the story that I was there to hear about how this group had functioned. That was a powerful story about war, and I think having gone through places where there were bullet holes in buildings and things blowing up and leaving Serbia on the morning that the Rambouillet talks were supposed to finish and not knowing if the war was going to go on, left me with a deep sense of how important it was that often just being with people is the doing. Being there, being present, listening. another story about working with Muslims and Muslim women, because I think we have a very unusual understanding about the Muslim faith, is that I was working in northern Pakistan in the Chitral. I had come in on a mission that was being done by the European Union, and there were several of us on this mission, and my job was to assess the effectiveness and feasibility of a health program. So it's a very rugged country. So we would be picked up and dropped off by helicopters in villages. And I remember the day that I was in a village with, there were a couple of different days where it was with men in a village, probably many days, but I was the only woman sitting with them. And I wore a shawa kameez, which I'd had made while I was there. And then I needed to wear this head scarf. 1997, I didn't see any burqas. I traveled comfortably. I was never afraid. I was always felt like I was cared for. And I only needed to wear this to demonstrate respect to the people I was around. And I remember the men, because we were talking about taking a traditional birth attendant program or a birth attendant program and moving family planning or child spacing into it. And one of the men said to me, the leader of the group said, "Why do women bleed when they take the shot that's supposed to be a 3-month shot for Depo-Provera that's supposed to be a birth control method? In front of all these men, why do women bleed?" I thought, this guy knows a lot about what's happening, and we can talk about it. And it's okay to talk to me as an American woman. Another man was explaining why he thought it was important, and he had his community gathered around him. And he said, "Look at us. We can't divide our land any longer to continue to divide up pieces of land. We have too many children. Look who has things and they're comfortable. They have food security, basically, and their children are well. They're the ones who have a few children, not the ones who have many." I left him and I went and sat with a group of women who had their headscarves off, and they were having a wonderful time, laughing and talking. You see, I've gone spirals in the conversation. I want to thank you for listening today. If you can take away one thought, it's listen to that thought, those sounds in your head where they say, "I don't think that's true," and say, "What don't I understand?" Thank you.